The wooden chair groaned under the weight of what had once been England's most athletic king. Henry VIII, now a grotesque mountain of flesh, weighing over 400 pounds, could no longer walk without assistance. His legs, once praised as the most beautiful in Christendom, had become putrid ulcerated stumps that oozed pus and blood. The stench was so overwhelming that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses when approaching the throne. This was not merely the decline of a monarch. This was the horrifying culmination of a 38-year feeding frenzy that had transformed a golden prince into a living corpse. The transformation began innocently enough in 1509, when 18-year-old Henry ascended to the throne. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a lean, muscular frame, he was the embodiment of Renaissance ideals. He could joust for hours, dance until dawn, and hunt stags through the royal forests with seemingly endless energy. Yet even then, those who knew him best noticed something unsettling about his relationship with food. Unlike other nobles who ate for sustenance or pleasure, Henry consumed with an intensity that bordered on violence. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court Palace were not merely cooking facilities. They were industrial-scale food production centers that operated like medieval factories of gluttony. Over 200 kitchen staff worked in shifts around the clock, their faces permanently reddened from the heat of 6 massive fires that burned continuously. These fires consumed between 6 and 8 tons of oak, daily creating an inferno that could be felt from rooms away. The great kitchen alone could roast an entire ox on a single spit, while smaller fires handled the endless parade of sheep, pigs, deer, and fowl that disappeared into the royal gullet. The numbers reveal the true horror of Henry's consumption. During peak years of his reign, the royal household slaughtered 8,200 sheep, 330 deer, 870 pigs, 40 oxen, 760 calves, and 53 wild boar annually. This was not food for the entire court. Much of it was destined for Henry's personal table. Contemporary accounts describe meals where the king would consume an entire roasted peacock as an appetizer, followed by a whole swan stuffed with smaller birds, then move on to joints of beef that would feed a peasant family for weeks. What made Henry's gluttony particularly disturbing was the ritualistic nature of his eating. Meals were not simply consumed, but performed like grotesque theatrical productions. The king would sit at the head of an enormous table, surrounded by dozens of dishes, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Each course was announced with fanfare, as if heralding the arrival of conquering armies rather than food. Henry would survey the spread with the calculating gaze of a general, planning a siege, methodically determining which dishes would fall first to his assault. The preparation of these meals involved techniques that seem almost occult in their complexity. Royal cooks developed methods for stuffing birds, within birds creating monstrous chimeras of flesh that defied natural order. A typical great pie might contain a whole pig stuffed with chickens, which were themselves stuffed with larks, all encased in a pastry fortress that required special tools to breach. These culinary abominations were not merely food, but symbols of Henry's power to bend nature itself to his will. As Henry's appetite grew, so did his paranoia about food. He became convinced that his enemies would attempt to poison him, leading to the establishment of elaborate tasting protocols that turned every meal into a ceremony of fear. Multiple tasters would sample each dish, their faces watched carefully for signs of distress or death. The king's food was prepared in locked rooms, transported in sealed containers, and served on plates that were tested for poison with special stones and powders. This obsession with food safety only intensified Henry's focus on eating, turning meals into high-stakes dramas where death lurked in every bite. The psychological transformation was as horrifying as the physical one. Courtiers began to notice that Henry's mood swings coincided with his eating patterns. When denied food or forced to wait for meals, he would fly into murderous rages that could result in executions. When gorging himself, he would enter states of euphoria that bordered on madness, making wild promises and declarations that he would later regret. Food had become his drug, and like any addict, he required ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effect. The king's dining habits began to affect the entire structure of court life. Meals stretched from hours to entire days, with Henry holding court from his dining chair while consuming course after course. Important matters of state were discussed between bites of roasted meat, and diplomatic negotiations were conducted over tables groaning under the weight of excessive food. Foreign ambassadors reported feeling nauseated, not just by the quantities consumed, but by the king's eating style. He would tear meat with his hands, grease running down his arms, while discussing matters of war and peace. By his 30s, Henry's body began to rebel against the constant assault of food. His once athletic frame started to expand at an alarming rate, but rather than moderating his intake, he seemed to interpret his growing size as a sign of his increasing power. He commissioned larger chairs, wider doorways, and stronger horses to accommodate his expanding form. The royal tailors worked constantly to let out his clothing, creating garments that resembled tents more than royal attire. The medical consequences began to manifest in ways that horrified even the court physicians. Henry developed what modern doctors would recognize as type 2 diabetes, but in the 16th century, it was seen as a mysterious curse that caused unquenchable thirst and constant hunger. The king would drink gallons of wine and ale daily, then demand more food to satisfy cravings that seemed to grow stronger with each meal. His urine became sweet-smelling, attracting flies that would swarm around him during outdoor events. Sleep became another casualty of Henry's gluttony. His massive weight made lying down difficult and dangerous, as he would often stop breathing during the night. Court physicians were forced to devise special sleeping arrangements, propping the king up with pillows and cushions to prevent him from suffocating on his own bulk. Even then, his sleep was fitful and interrupted by digestive distress that would send him stumbling to the privy multiple times each night. The king's legs, once his pride, became instruments of torture. The constant pressure of his enormous weight caused his circulation to fail, leading to ulcers that would never heal. These wounds became infected, producing a smell so foul that it could clear rooms. The royal physicians tried everything: poultices, bloodletting, even primitive surgical procedures. But nothing could stop the rot that was consuming Henry from within. The ulcers wept, constantly staining his stockings and leaving trails of pus wherever he walked. Despite the horrifying deterioration of his body, Henry's appetite only intensified as he entered his 40s. What had begun as royal excess had transformed into something far more sinister, a compulsion that seemed to possess him like a malevolent spirit. The king's physicians, sworn to secrecy about his condition, watched in horror as their sovereign literally ate himself to death before their eyes. They documented symptoms that read like accounts of demonic possession, uncontrollable cravings, violent mood swings when food was delayed, and an insatiable hunger that no amount of consumption could satisfy. The royal kitchens had evolved into something resembling a medieval version of hell. The constant fires created temperatures that regularly killed kitchen staff from heat exhaustion. Workers would collapse while turning the massive spits their bodies dragged away, to be replaced by fresh victims of Henry's gluttony. The floors ran with grease and blood from the endless parade of slaughtered animals, creating a slippery, treacherous surface that claimed its own casualties. The very air was thick with smoke, and the stench of burning fat, creating an atmosphere so toxic that many workers developed permanent respiratory ailments. Henry's eating schedule had become a grotesque parody of religious observance. He would rise before dawn, not for prayer, but for what he called his morning feast, a meal that would have fed a small village. This typically consisted of an entire roasted chicken, a joint of beef, several meat pies, and enough bread to fill a baker's cart. By mid-morning, he would demand his second breakfast, followed by an elaborate lunch that could last for hours. Afternoon brought light refreshments that included whole roasted birds and flagons of wine, leading to a dinner that was less a meal than a sustained assault on the natural order. The psychological toll of this constant consumption was perhaps even more disturbing than the physical effects. Henry began to exhibit behaviors that suggested his relationship with food had crossed into the realm of the pathological. He would hoard food in his private chambers, hiding joints of meat and loaves of bread like a starving peasant preparing for siege. Courtiers reported finding rotting food stashed in the king's furniture, evidence of a mind that had lost all rational connection to hunger and satiety. The king's paranoia about food reached levels that bordered on madness. He became convinced that his enemies were not only trying to poison him, but were also attempting to steal his food. Guards were posted around the royal kitchens with orders to kill anyone who attempted to remove food without explicit permission. Henry would count the dishes brought to his table, flying into murderous rages if he suspected that any had been removed or tampered with. On one occasion, he ordered the execution of a kitchen servant who had been caught eating scraps from the royal table, declaring that theft of the king's food was tantamount to treason. The mechanical challenges of feeding Henry became increasingly complex as his weight continued to climb. Special chairs had to be constructed with reinforced frames and wheels to transport him to the dining hall. These contraptions, operated by teams of servants, creaked and groaned under his massive bulk. The chairs themselves became symbols of his transformation, ornate thrones that had become mobile prisons trapping a king who could no longer support his own weight. By his late 40s, Henry's weight had reached an estimated 400 pounds, making him one of the most obese individuals in recorded history. His face had become so swollen that his eyes appeared as mere slits in a mountain of flesh. His neck had disappeared entirely, creating the unsettling impression of a head balanced directly on massive shoulders. When he spoke, his voice had changed from the commanding tone of his youth to a wheeze that struggled to escape from his constricted throat. The ulcers on his legs had become so severe that they required constant attention from a team of physicians and surgeons. These wounds, some as large as a man's fist, never healed due to his poor circulation and continued weight gain. The smell emanating from these infected sores was so overwhelming that it could be detected from rooms away. Courtiers developed elaborate strategies to avoid being downwind of the king, and many began requesting transfers to distant posts to escape the nauseating presence of their sovereign. Henry's mobility became so limited that he required mechanical assistance for even the most basic activities. A system of pulleys and ropes was installed in his bedchamber to help him rise from bed each morning. Special ramps were constructed throughout his palaces to accommodate his wheeled chair, and doorways were widened to allow his massive frame to pass through. The king, who had once been renowned for his athletic prowess, now required a team of servants to help him perform basic bodily functions. The impact on the royal court was profound and disturbing. Meals which had once been social occasions became grotesque spectacles that courtiers attended with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Henry would consume his food with an intensity that seemed almost violent, tearing at meat with his hands and gulping wine as if his life depended on it. The sounds of his eating, the slurping chomping and heavy breathing, filled the dining hall with a symphony of gluttony that left many guests unable to consume their own meals. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their courts with accounts that seemed too incredible to believe. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Henry eats enough for 3 men and drinks proportionally, while the French envoy described meals where the king would consume quantities of food that would shame a glutton. These diplomatic reports, preserved in archives across Europe, provide a chilling record of a monarch's descent into madness through food. The king's physicians, bound by oath to maintain his health, found themselves in an impossible position. They could see that Henry's eating habits were killing him, but any attempt to restrict his diet was met with violent resistance. The king would threaten execution for anyone who dared suggest he moderate his consumption, declaring that his appetite was a sign of his royal vigor. Several court physicians requested transfers or resigned their positions rather than continue to witness their sovereign's self-destruction. Henry's relationship with his wives became increasingly strained as his condition worsened. His massive size made physical intimacy difficult, if not impossible, and his constant focus on food left little room for other concerns. Anne of Cleves reportedly fainted upon first seeing Henry in person, having been told he was still the athletic king of his youth. Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, was said to have wept openly at their wedding feast as she watched her new husband consume course after course with mechanical determination. The economic impact of Henry's gluttony was staggering. The cost of feeding the royal court had grown to consume nearly a quarter of the kingdom's annual revenue. Entire forests were cleared to provide fuel for the royal kitchens, and the demand for meat had driven up prices across England. Farmers were required to provide tribute in the form of livestock, creating shortages that led to malnutrition among the common people. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. While the king ate himself to death, his subjects often went hungry. As Henry entered his final years, his eating habits took on an almost ritualistic quality that suggested a man preparing for his own demise. He would spend hours each day planning his meals, dictating elaborate menus that read like military campaigns against the animal kingdom. These menus, preserved in royal archives, reveal the mind of a man who had lost all connection to normal human needs and desires. The king's sleep patterns became increasingly erratic as his weight made rest nearly impossible. He would often fall asleep at the dining table, his massive head dropping into his food while servants stood by helplessly. These episodes became more frequent as his condition worsened, creating scenes that courtiers described as both pitiful and terrifying. The final years of Henry VIII's life read like a medical horror story written by a madman. By 1546, the king had become a grotesque parody of his former self, a mountain of diseased flesh that required an army of servants to maintain even the most basic functions of life. His weight had reached such extremes that the floorboards of Hampton Court had to be reinforced to prevent them from collapsing under his bulk. The man who had once danced until dawn now struggled to remain conscious for more than a few hours at a time, his body shutting down under the relentless assault of decades of gluttony. The ulcers on Henry's legs had become so severe that they had begun to eat through to the bone. Court physicians described wounds that were as wide as a man's hand and as deep as a dagger's blade, constantly weeping a mixture of pus and blood that stained everything it touched. The smell had become so overwhelming that even the king's most loyal servants would retch when changing his bandages. Yet still, Henry continued to eat with the same mechanical determination that had characterized his consumption for decades. What made Henry's final decline particularly horrifying was his complete denial of his condition. Even as his body literally rotted around him, he continued to plan elaborate feasts and demand ever more exotic foods. His physicians, desperate to save their sovereign's life, attempted to introduce lighter fare, broths, vegetables, and smaller portions. But Henry would fly into murderous rages at any suggestion that his diet was responsible for his condition. He executed his personal physician, Dr. William Butts, for daring to suggest that moderation might extend his life. The king's eating habits in his final year defied all logic and medical understanding. Despite being barely able to move, he would consume meals that would challenge a healthy man half his age. A typical breakfast consisted of an entire roasted chicken, a joint of beef, several meat pies, a loaf of bread, and enough ale to fill a small barrel. This would be followed within hours by what he called his morning refreshment, another full meal that included roasted birds, cheese, and wine. By the time evening arrived, Henry would have consumed enough food to feed a dozen men. The mechanical challenges of feeding the dying king became increasingly complex and disturbing. Special feeding chairs were constructed with built-in tables and restraints to keep Henry upright during his marathon eating sessions. Teams of servants worked in shifts to bring him food, as the king's appetite seemed to operate independently of day and night. Court records show orders for food being delivered to the royal chambers at all hours, suggesting that Henry's eating had become a continuous process rather than discrete meals. The psychological deterioration was perhaps even more disturbing than the physical decay. Henry began to exhibit behaviors that suggested his mind had been completely consumed by thoughts of food. He would spend hours staring at empty plates, apparently hallucinating meals that weren't there. Courtiers reported conversations where the king would describe elaborate feasts in vivid detail, only to become enraged when the imaginary food failed to materialize. His grip on reality had become so tenuous that he seemed to exist in a world where food was the only constant. The king's paranoia about food reached its peak in his final months. He became convinced that his enemies were not only trying to poison him, but were also stealing his food while he slept. Guards were posted inside his bedchamber, with orders to watch his food stores throughout the night. Henry would wake multiple times to count his provisions, becoming increasingly agitated if he suspected that anything had been removed. On several occasions, he ordered the execution of servants who had been caught near his food supplies, regardless of their actual intentions. The impact on the royal court was profound and lasting. Courtiers who had once competed for the honor of dining with the king now sought excuses to avoid his presence. The stench emanating from his rotting legs, combined with the nauseating sounds of his eating, created an atmosphere that many found unbearable. Foreign ambassadors began requesting shorter audiences, and some refused to attend royal meals altogether, claiming diplomatic immunity from what they privately described as the king's feeding frenzies. Henry's relationship with his final wife, Catherine Parr, became strained to the breaking point as his condition worsened. She was forced to watch helplessly as her husband consumed himself to death, knowing that any attempt to intervene would likely result in her own execution. Court records suggest that Catherine spent much of her time in prayer, not for Henry's recovery, but for his soul, and for her own deliverance from the nightmare her marriage had become. The economic impact of Henry's gluttony in his final years was catastrophic. The cost of feeding the king and his court had grown to consume nearly half of the royal treasury. Entire regions of England were stripped of livestock to satisfy the royal appetite, creating food shortages that led to widespread malnutrition among the common people. The irony was stark and cruel. While Henry ate himself to death in his palace, his subjects often went to bed hungry, their food requisitioned to feed their dying king's insatiable appetite. As 1547 dawned, it became clear that Henry's body could no longer sustain the punishment he had inflicted upon it for nearly 4 decades. His physicians, those brave enough to remain in his service, documented symptoms that read like a catalog of dietary-induced diseases. His heart, struggling to pump blood through his massive frame, would race and flutter unpredictably. His liver, overwhelmed by decades of excessive alcohol consumption, had begun to fail, causing his skin to take on a yellowish tinge that made him appear corpse-like even while alive. The king's breathing became increasingly labored as his weight compressed his lungs and airways. He would often fall asleep while eating his massive head, dropping forward into his food as his body desperately tried to rest. These episodes became more frequent and lasted longer, creating scenes that courtiers described as both pitiful and terrifying. The man who had once commanded armies and reshaped the religious landscape of Europe was now defeated by his own appetite. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII finally succumbed to the consequences of his lifelong gluttony. His death was not the peaceful passing of a great king, but the inevitable conclusion of a decades-long suicide by food. Contemporary accounts describe his final moments as a struggle between his body's desperate need for rest and his mind's continued obsession with eating. Even as he lay dying, Henry reportedly asked for food, his last coherent words being a request for roasted meat. The aftermath of Henry's death revealed the true extent of his transformation. It took 8 men to carry his coffin, and special reinforcements had to be added to support his massive weight. During the funeral procession, the coffin reportedly burst open due to the pressure of gases from his decomposing body, creating a scene that horrified witnesses and seemed to symbolize the grotesque excess that had defined his later years. The autopsy, conducted in secret by royal physicians, revealed a body that had been systematically destroyed by food. Henry's heart was enlarged to twice its normal size. His liver was riddled with fatty deposits, and his stomach had stretched to accommodate volumes of food that defied medical understanding. The ulcers on his legs had eaten through to the bone in several places, and infection had spread throughout his lower body. The physicians concluded that Henry had essentially poisoned himself through excessive consumption, creating a toxic environment within his own body that had made recovery impossible. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of Henry's final meal still partially undigested in his stomach. Even in death, the king's body bore witness to his final act of gluttony, a meal that included roasted fowl, beef bread, and wine consumed just hours before his death. It was a fitting end to a life that had been defined by the relentless pursuit of culinary excess. The legacy of Henry VIII's horrific diet extends far beyond his own death. His transformation from athletic prince to grotesque glutton serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked appetite and absolute power. The detailed records kept by his court provide historians with one of the most complete documentations of how food addiction can literally consume a human being from within. Modern medical experts who have studied Henry's case believe he suffered from a combination of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, liver failure, and severe obesity-related complications. His symptoms, the uncontrollable appetite, mood swings, infected wounds that wouldn't heal, and eventual organ failure, paint a picture of a man whose body had been systematically destroyed by his own choices. The story of Henry VIII's diet remains one of history's most disturbing examples of how power without restraint can lead to self-destruction. His transformation from England's golden prince to a rotting mountain of flesh serves as a reminder that even kings are not immune to the consequences of their actions. In the end, Henry VIII was not defeated by foreign enemies or domestic rebellion, but by his own insatiable appetite, a hunger that ultimately consumed not just his body, but his soul.